Today's show is sponsored by Mailtrap, modern email delivery for developers. The complete email API that does everything you need it to do. Try it today at mailtrap.io and get 20% off for all plans with the promo code CLOUDCAST. That's mailtrap.io, mailtrap.io.
Cloudcast Media presents from the massive studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. This is the Cloudcast with Aaron Delp and Brian Gracely, bringing you the best of cloud computing from around the world.
Good morning, good evening, wherever you are, and welcome back to the Cloudcast. We are coming to you live from the massive Cloudcast studios here in Raleigh, North Carolina. Hope everybody is doing well. Another weekend perspective as we get to the middle of December of 2025, the last month of the year, almost done, but not yet to the holidays. Hope everybody's doing well. One of the things I talked about in last week's Weekend Perspective, we were talking a little bit about kind of the future of platform as a service, or really maybe what may evolve, maybe even on top of what we think of as platform as a service, or on top of SaaS, in terms of just trying to make it simpler to kind of connect the dots between business ideas, business operations, and maybe some of the applications or the technology that would happen there. And one of the things I was talking about during that was kind of this idea I had, or just kind of thought that I had, that there would become a marketplace for experts. That would essentially, the expert would be an AI agent. And the thinking around that kind of originated somewhat. I think it was OpenAI. It might have been Anthropic, but I think it was OpenAI. There was some articles published. I'll put a link in the show note talking about how they were working with a number of folks in financial services to try and create essentially AI experts, or whatever we might call them, kind of trained up on the skill set that experts, domain experts, have in this space. And so it kind of got me thinking, okay, well, if that's something that OpenAI is doing, and they're doing it in one market, we would probably expect over time, assuming they figure out a way to scale and effective way to do it cost effectively, you might expect this in many markets, right? In many domains, and many markets, and so forth. And the more I thought about it, especially I was sort of thinking about it this week, like, how would you go about doing that? I'm starting to sort of second guess myself on that, or sort of question how that might play itself out. And so I thought it might be sort of interesting just to sort of walk through the thought process of how that might play itself out, both sort of pros and cons. And we'll do that after the break. Self-driving cars, delivery drones, and fleets of automated mining machines have moved from headlines to habits, but they can only travel as fast as the tech underneath it. On Interconnected, a new show by Equinix that explores the hidden infrastructure behind our connected future, they shed light on the challenges of scaling safety, where computation happens, and a future where cities are built with autonomy in mind. MIT research scientist Brian Reimer and emerging technology leader Patrina Steele explain how the way we move is changing and where the future will take us. Listen on Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts. And we're back. And as I mentioned at the top of the show, I want to dig into a little bit about just kind of the thought process of, what might be needed to go about building one of these expert agents. And I guess, I probably should begin by kind of getting into thinking about, what would an expert be, first and foremost? This could be, an expert in some sort of, I guess, maybe well-defined discipline like accounting or taxes or, law or, something along those lines, in which, you go, well, there's an entire path of study that people do for those types of jobs. And therefore, there must be a way to, train an agent or train a computer on all of that knowledge. And then, the same way that you would have, trained that human being to achieve that certification, to achieve that level of knowledge, to go out into the marketplace, whether it's through case studies or something else, there must be a way to go about doing that. And, I kind of wrote out my thoughts around, okay, what would the steps be to go about doing that? And it feels like there is, a number of the steps are fairly straightforward. But then there starts to get into a number of things in which, there's a lot of gray areas in which you'd have to figure out, okay, how do I go about, creating ways of thinking that are outside the lines of sort of standard practices for that job. Right. So anyways, this is kind of how I was thinking about it. And then we'll get into a little bit about like what would the ramifications of that be. So let's say, for example, that, we go back to that sort of PaaS example I talked about last week, in which we go, okay, you build this business, and obviously one of the things that almost every business needs is going to be somebody on the financial side that deals with accounting, for example. So this could be an entire financial department, but let's just say that you said, well, we really need an accountant, somebody who can make sure that we are compliant in the things that we do, accounting, auditing, tax, those types of things. And you say, okay, well, is there a way to, because some of those things are fairly straightforward and standard, and filling out of forms and, checking boxes of what compliance means and doesn't mean and so forth. Maybe you could go about building an agent that is repetitive enough and can plug into just your standard systems of whatever systems you use, go about doing that. And then I got to thinking about, okay, let's suppose that could actually happen. How would somebody, some company, some entity go about training that expert, right? And again, we'll just use accounting as a standard thing. Maybe that's a good example. Maybe it's a terrible example. It doesn't really matter. So, as I was thinking about it, the first thing you would try and do is, you're probably going to be, basing it off of some standard sort of frontier model that has sort of all of the knowledge of human language and the nuances of language built in. So let's just assume that. Next thing you'd want to do is train in a set of standard knowledge. Like I said, all of the knowledge required to get you through, the mathematics that is part of accounting, which is, pretty much standard, kind of standard mathematics. But then you would get into the things that, anybody would take in order to maybe get to a master's level of accounting, right? So, undergraduate accounting, undergraduate business, text and context, masters of accounting, auditing, international tax, all those sorts of things that would go into what would be the equivalent of a business degree with a accounting focus, as well as maybe like an accounting master's or MBA. And if there are advanced certifications above and beyond that, you would train it on all of that, coursework, if you will, right? Both the textbooks. The nice thing is you probably can throw lots and lots of textbooks at it, whether it is textbooks over the years or just textbooks from different organizations that write them and so forth. You can go about doing all that. The second thing you probably want to do is train on a set of well-defined case studies to provide some sort of industry context. So you're not just saying like, here's how you create a balance sheet, or here's how you create a cash flow statement, but how does somebody go about applying that? And then what are the sort of real world use cases of applying that? And then within those case studies, you would expect that there would be, a bunch of corner cases or a bunch of, sort of what ifs that would, go about trying to question whether or not you understand the fundamentals, but also how would you go about thinking what the trade-offs are. The next thing you would probably need to do is trade in on a set of adjacent case studies for other domains, that, kind of adjacent domains, whether it's business or law or specific industries, the rules and regulations of, the oil and gas industry, for example, or shipping or, manufacturing, whatever those things might be. So at that point, you would assume that it has a set of knowledge that should be kind of the corpus of what you would expect any, trained professional in a domain, or somebody within an area, and some level of kind of, okay, how would this be applied to real world scenarios through case studies or whatever that might be. Then you have to start sort of training it. I would expect that you would do just like you do with any sort of program or programming language or program that you write. That might be 20% of what you do, and then the next 80% becomes how do you train it on corner cases. Same way that you build applications in which 20 or 30% of the code is the code, and then the other 60, 70, 80% is kind of corner cases and error handling and problem situations, and like how do you get out of these so that you don't blow up, right? So you'd have to figure out how you go about doing that, and that to me feels like corner cases in programming feels like you begin to start to have domain expertise. You have to think through how would people interact with your system. This feels like experience, right? How do you go about getting the experience that somebody who has done 5 years of accounting gets, or 5 years of auditing, or 10 years, or 15 years, right? How do you go about quantifying that? And that feels to me like it comes back to this thing that I keep running into it with every company that I talk to and every kind of professional I talk to is, how would you go about quantifying or, kind of writing down or putting onto paper, putting pen to paper or of some sort, what your job is, what your expertise is, what you do, how you think through your problematic things, how do you interact with teams and so forth. So I feel like, that's where we start to get sort of stuck. Is it doesn't yet feel like there's a simple way of doing that, although maybe there is, just kind of, letting somebody have access to all of the information that you use all the time, your email and the kind of content that you read, and looking at the output of like meetings that you have and what the interactions are between people within those meetings. I mean, so all those things might be helpful in trying to train a corner case. Then you start to get into, how do you train for gray areas, right? So not so much just like corner cases, like, okay, let's suppose, this weird scenario happens, but what about gray areas? So, this is where, again, kind of ties to experience and expertise, but how do you train it around things like ethics or morality or cost benefit analysis, in which, there can be lots of different outputs, and somehow, you've got to be able to measure those outputs and cost benefit against, external goals, or, your experience, or understanding what, your client needs are and how they like things. And so again, this feels like we're starting to get into a level of experience that needs to come from actually being in the domain, that you probably aren't going to necessarily get from just kind of being out of the box, essentially the equivalent of being a college graduate and being thrown into your first job. So all those things feel like stuff that, would be part of the process. And I'm just thinking about those purely in the sense of like, well, how do you bring somebody up from, kind of learning in an academic setting to learning in a kind of a real world setting, to having multiple years of experience with enough scenarios that they've, looked at things that are straightforward, things that, work around broken problems, work around unusual situations that, involve both people and rules and regulations and all sorts of things like that. So, but all those things feel like, there are probably people who can figure out how to train around those things, right? The expert part of it, the experience part of it seems obviously much more difficult to me, but, there are probably people who are figuring those sorts of things out, right? Then you start to get into sort of asking yourself the question of who would be motivated to train these expert systems, right? So if you are, for example, a given accounting firm, is this something that you want to do, right? Do you want to train an AI agent upon the thing? And this is maybe you do, maybe you don't. Maybe you look at it and you say, well, we have a great system in place to bring people up in our way of doing things, and we don't necessarily want to share that. In other cases, you might say, well, over time, human resources are a difficult thing to manage, because, I have to train them, I have to pay them, I have to, bring them up through the thing. I have to incrementally continue to pay them more and more, based on their expertise. Over time, people get sick, they move, they have, life events that might, impact their ability to work consistently for years on end. Maybe, a family situation comes up, a female accountant gets pregnant and she decides to maybe leave the firm, or leave for a year, or leave for 6 months, or, ask for, a different situation to help, manage childcare, whatever those things might be. Somebody could get sick, somebody could have a health issue. All sorts of things come up that aren't just sort of, I have a worker forever in the same situation that they are, when they're 35 as when they're 55, or when they're 65, or whatever it might be. So, there could be, any given individual accounting firm might want to do this. You could see, potentially the, some sort of third party, that works today with, say, accounting firms, maybe that sells them expertise types of systems that they go, oh, well, this would be a good thing to offer as an augmentation to the firm. It could help the firm, grow their business, right? So again, now we're still talking about sort of experts within the domain of other experts, a firm that specializes in that. But, would you see that kind of outside of that, right? Could you see the equivalent of like an independent accountant just being, independent accountant that is represented as an AI agent, just available in a marketplace? Maybe, sure. Yeah, I mean, it's possible. So then the next thing I start asking myself was, what would be the cost of these experts, right? What would it be? And what's a realistic way of thinking about what the cost of this should be. Is it something that should be thought of as, well, let's suppose I pay a great accountant, just for round numbers, $200,000 a year, right? Maybe that's all inclusive. Maybe that's way under. I don't know. It's just a number. Should I think about this AI agent as being somebody, something that I should pay $200,000 a year for, right? If what the cost should be, and if that was the case, maybe that is great, because in reality, if I pay somebody $200,000 a year in salary, if you start to now add on PTO time, that's work that I'm paying for that doesn't get done. There are hours of the day, outside of like normal 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. that work doesn't get done. Maybe these AI agents could work for longer than that. We still don't necessarily see, at least agents at like the coding level that are able to work for those long periods of time. So you would expect that an accounting agent probably still has similar limitations of, it's not going to just be able to work 24 hours a day. But maybe it can, right? Maybe it's dependent upon how deterministic the work is for what you're doing versus the creativity level of what the work is. But, so you start to get into saying, well, for example, if I'm paying somebody $200,000 for basically an 8-hour day, but a regular day is 24 hours, I'm paying for an entire person's time, but I'm really only getting a third of the day of work. If I was paying $200,000 and I could get even 12 hours of work, that seems like it would be a benefit. I also then wouldn't have to pay for health insurance or fund their 401k or any other sort of employer benefits that you would likely pay. And that doesn't mean that down the road there won't be some sort of thing in which there's taxes that have to be paid for this. You probably wouldn't have to fund. I don't know. We'll see what laws and regulations look like. You wouldn't necessarily have to fund, again, all the things that we typically do in terms of employee benefits, just that are expected to make somebody motivated to work in your company, right? So maybe that's one way of looking at it. The next way to look at it is, well, how do I measure the level of expertise of this, right? Is it, today, there's things you can do if you interview somebody and they've got 5 years of experience versus 10 versus 20 years of experience. You're probably going to pay a premium as that experience grows and the type of work that they've done has expanded, and all those sorts of things, right? But with an agent, how are they going to necessarily measure that? Are you going to be buying a 5-year experience agent, a 10-year experience agent, a 20-year experience agent? And will the price go accordingly, or do you just sort of go, well, that sort of price should be amortized across the fact that whoever is selling that agent, can doesn't cost any more per se. Maybe it does to train them for that, right? So I would expect that I'd probably pay a premium for that. But how do I mentally measure a 10-year experience versus 20-year experience, right? And the question becomes like, should my thinking be, well, this is just like a computer, right? Maybe I should be paying a tenth of the price for it. I don't know, right? I think there's a whole thing to figure out what people should expect to pay for that, and then what they should expect to pay at various price levels and experience levels, and trying to just sort of work through in your head, what does that look like, right? Do you have the normal issues of things like cost of living? Right? Does it matter? That probably shouldn't have to pay a premium if your business is based in, Boston versus being like, well, I don't necessarily need an agent that is based out of Boston and the cost of, premium that goes with that, or San Francisco or some high level market. Maybe I just want the equivalent of, somebody who works here in Raleigh as a lower cost of living, right? So all those sort of things that, again, I'm not trying to advocate for getting rid of people. I'm just trying to advocate for, if these types of services start to become available, do we think through the same sort of things that we think through in terms of people, whether it's salary or benefits or cost of living adjustments or number of hours of the day or all those sorts of things, or is there going to be a complete rethink that happens with that, right? So that was on my list of things to sort of think through. And again, that doesn't necessarily have to do with like certain things, but I think there are other parts of it. And the next thing I had in my mind, and I feel like this is still an open-ended thing for AI in general, is, is there a way to build memory of one of these experts, i.e. experience, without, as it interacts with, say, your business, without disclosing client information, right? Is there a way of saying like, hey, you worked on these 50 scenarios. Those scenarios obviously are, partially, a piece of it is going to be sort of standard accounting, but a piece of it is going to be specific to the client that it's working for. How do you separate those things, right? Like how do you pull those apart, so that the experience of doing it could potentially go back into the system, so the system becomes more intelligent. Maybe regulations have changed or something along those lines, but separating that from the actual actions that were taken by the client. Maybe it's as simple as just abstracting client information, PII information. But I'd be curious as to how that happens. And then the last thing I had on my list was: is there a way to, if you are a company that somehow offered a AI agent into a marketplace and it got used by 50 different companies, is there a way to, again, sort of abstract that knowledge, that experience that was learned, the outputs that was learned from those 50 companies, bring them back into the system, but again, in the same way of sort of abstracting out those 50 clients, so that the goal would be that your agent got smarter. Hopefully you're providing more value into the marketplace, but again, doing that without, without, exposing how it went about getting smarter, right? So, not sure exactly how that works, but, the more and more I think about this, the more I go, it feels like we are quite a long way from, going back to my original premise of like, the next generation of paths will be the ability for, kind of anybody to connect the dots between a business problem and the technology that'll help you with that. I think the coding assistant type of world that we're seeing, whether it's what Anthropic's doing with Claude, or what Cursor's doing, for developers, or what, others are doing, a Vercel is doing with V0, all feel like things that are moving it in that direction in the software development space. But in terms of the marketplace for experts, it still feels like everything is sort of an augmentation of, like an assistant or a helper to somebody who is a human iteration of that expert. So, it feels like, we've got somewhat of a disconnect between, if you're thinking about, how much can AI help build a business, the sort of mythical one-person company. And again, I'm not advocating for it one way or the other, just trying to, sort of think through like what would the timing of that looks like. It does feel like some domains or some tasks are far further along than others. And the more I think about this sort of, how would an expert in a domain be built, that again, isn't necessarily software development, or assisting a software developer. It is in some other domain. It feels like that is further behind than we see in software development. So it does sort of break my future of paths thing, because the timing of it is off. But I don't know that the vision of it is necessarily off. But again, I think there's a lot of complexity involved in the training of it. The details of what the marketplaces would look like, the details of, how do those marketplaces become interesting and efficient in terms of, continuing to provide value for the people that people and companies that would use them. And then for the people that, actually are able to go about training these things or creating these agents, how do you create a feedback mechanism, a reinforcement learning mechanism in which your systems can continue to get smarter, and be able to then reuse that into another client or another situation, or even just, maybe upselling, this new value back into the clients that you're working with. So anyways, kind of a lot of open-ended thinking there, but, would be curious for anybody who's beginning to build agents beyond things that just do sort of process and task automation. What are you seeing in terms of the ability of these systems to begin to think about open-ended questions? How far along do you see them? How mature do you see them? And then where do you start to see them? Do you see them in certain domains or certain types of tasks that make more sense than others that feel just very, very far away? And I'm especially interested if you're doing any thinking around kind of, how do you create sort of expert level for any task. Even just, ask the question, for yourself, like how would you create you in your job, assuming that you are, good at your job. So anyways, that'll wrap it up. Just some thoughts. Again, really interested in folks' feedback. Show at thecloudcast.net if you want to hit us up on that, or if you're over on the Software Defined Talk Slack, we do have a Cloudcast channel there. Love to get your feedback on that as well. So anyways, with that, we'll wrap it up. We'll talk to you next week.
Thank you for listening to The Cloudcast. Please visit thecloudcast.net to find more shows, show notes, videos, and everything social media.